And hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm very pleased to introduce today Dr. Bert Bakker. Dr. Bakker is an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam and the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. His research focuses on contemporary issues of social polarization and populism. In particular, he studies the psychological roots of citizens' political beliefs, incorporating the role of personality and emotions. Dr. Bakker is one of the leading experts in political psychology today and is the co-founder of the Hot Politics Lab, a lab group studying the role of emotions and personality in politics. So we're very pleased to have you today. And it's all yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm gonna share my screen so that we can see the slides. Share screen. Wait, advanced. Okay. Ja. Oh, wacht even. Classic. Right, sorry, my computer has some complaints. What's going on? Sorry, I have some background music that I want to turn off.
No worries.
Hey, what is this? What's going on here? Well, it's okay. I'll do it like this. Okay, you see my screen? Excellent. And you don't have this annoying little background noise?
No, but we don't see the PowerPoint, right? Now we see your PowerPoint.
Excellent. Okay. Hey, okay. Sorry for the little disruption. After 2 years of Zoom, I will be able to do this at one point without any problems. But hey, I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm gonna talk you a bit through some of my thought process and sort of where updating of some of my own beliefs based on some of the work that I've been doing in the past years, and it broadly is captured by the theme like reconsidering the relationship between personality and politics. So we have a lot of media coverage across the world about the role of personality in politics, right? So Donald Trump definitely sparked some interest in whether or not we could explain some of his behavior by looking into his personality, but there's obviously a broader literature also around Brexit, for instance, whether or not certain disposition predisposed people to be either in favor or against of something like Brexit. And here you have an NPR conversation about, sort of the nature of our political beliefs, because this idea is that perhaps part of who we are in terms of our political beliefs is rooted in our more deeper seated psychological traits and maybe even our more broader biological makeup. So you see quite a bit of coverage on this literature, which then also always has kind of a bit of an alarming conclusion, because if we consider personality a disposition and sort of a biological makeup, something that is sort of set in who we are, then if that is correlated with our political beliefs, then it might be really difficult to overcome things like polarization, because it is rooted in our personality. That has sort of been the starting point of some of this literature, and prominent contributions. You might be aware of the work by John Jost on this in his influential meta-analysis in 2003, and an annual review piece with Chris Federico in 2009. But also John Hibbing and Kevin Smith from University of Nebraska have written a pretty influential piece. This one is from Hibbing and Smith in Behavior and Brain Sciences, where they argue that ideological differences are related to can be explained by a negativity bias, so that conservatives, people on the right, I'm going to use conservative and right wing interchangeably, and liberal and left wing interchangeably, but conservatives would be more sensitive to threats. Their personality would be more closed. They would be more conscientious compared to liberals. And this work has a long tradition, right? It does not something that is new. Goes back to the work by Adorno, and also people like Schneiderman and TeDCog and many others have worked on this question for a long period of time. And I have been contributing to this literature a little bit as well myself. But for me, some of the concerns that I got is when I tried to replicate an important paper by the Hibbing and Smith crew in their science paper from 2008, which showed that conservatives compared to liberals have a stronger physiological response to threats compared to liberals. So we replicated that paper that was published in 2008 in Science, the original paper, and we found really no evidence that conservative people on the right have a stronger physiological response to threatening images compared to liberals. We published a paper 2020 in Nature Human Behavior, and some of the response we gotten from that from once that paper came out is like, no, okay, yeah, the physiological part, yeah, that's not setting apart liberals and conservatives, but we know a lot about personality. And I was like, yeah, that's true, but it's also puzzling, right? And so I said, well, I was getting motivated to delve a little bit deeper into this personality and politics literature to test some of its foundations. So if you look at the behavior brain sciences paper, for instance, and also in Joe's work, one of the predominant evidence is based on cross-sectional research, right? Self-reported psychological traits are correlated with self-reported political preferences, and it's obviously not a secret that cannot disentangle the causal relationship. You can make some assumptions saying that, well, personality develops in childhood, is heritable, as neurological correlates, and therefore politics, which is much more abstract and might come a little later in life, should be caused by personality. But the design of these studies cannot speak to it. But the studies often have this implicit causal ordering. I have myself made that as well in some of my own work. But some of the work that there's some work that suggests that there might be a causal effect, and this is, for instance, from a quote from the 2014 paper that shows that also infants with stronger negativity biases, so infants who are more easily upset, angry, disrupted, they also grow up in later life to become more politically conservative. And this is an important building block of this literature, because that suggests, well, hey, something when early childhood personality is related to adult ideology. This comes from the work by Block and Block, which in 2006 published a paper concluding that adults with a conservative ideology were viewed as uncomfortable with uncertainty, as susceptible to a sense of guilt, and as rectifying when experiencing dureness. This is the 2006 paper published in Journal of Research and Personality, and conceptually replicated by Fraley and others a couple years later in 2012 in Psychological Science. And it's an important building block for this literature because it's really sort of early childhood, age 1, 2, 3 personality that correlates with ideology at age 18 to 26. But if we look closely at this literature, this literature, there are a couple of limitations, and you could also wonder if we need to extend some of it. Well, the Block and Block 2006 paper definitely has some sense of selective reporting. They have 100-item childhood personality battery, and they analyze boys and girls separately. And in total, so you have 200 correlations with adult ideology, but out of these 200 correlations, only 42 are statistically significant at a p-value of 0.1. And if we look at the actual items that were used, many that were closely related to the 42 that correlated with ideology were not correlated with ideology. So there seems to be some selective reporting, or at least it seems that the findings are not so consistent as you might think they are if you just read the paper the first time. The sample size is also small. It's only 95 people from a particular area in the United States, namely the area around Stanford University. Ideology is, for political scientists, at least a multidimensional concept. So ideology is not just how liberal or conservative you are, but it's structured in multiple dimensions and generally considered a social-cultural dimension, capturing things like attitudes towards abortion, gay rights, immigration, and an economic dimension. Research in political psychology suggests that personality might correlate more consistently with social conservative policy preferences than with the economic ones. So we've also thought, well, we might need to decompose some of it. Moreover, if we look at the age at which adult ideology is measured, this is at the ages between 18 and 26. This is an age when you still see a bigger effect of genetic, of shared genetic aspects, and also childhood effects. So perhaps this is also a likely case to find childhood effects still. Moreover, there are only 2 samples. It's because the Fraley sample is also from the United States in one context. So there's plenty of reasons to say, well, could we replicate this? And that is what we tried to do here. We took 2 cohort studies from the UK, the 1958 National Child Development Study, which is a cohort of all kids born in the UK in a week in March in 1958. Their childhood personality was measured at age 7 and 11, and then their ideology was measured at age 41, 42. So there's a large lag between childhood personality and adult ideology. And we also took the 1970 British cohort study. Their same idea, cohort of all kids born in 1970. Personality was measured at age 5 and 10, and ideology at age 42, 43. The nice thing is that the childhood personality measures that were included in these surveys pretty closely match the ones that were used by Block and Block and by Fraley. The ideology measures are conceptually similar, but the items are not entirely the same. Well, this is obviously for replication important, but I think we should also get some credits because it's not so easy to replicate cohort studies, right? They're a bit difficult to do. Well, you have to sit and wait for quite some time before your replication is ready. So we think it's justifiable what we do. Say this about open science practices. The 1958 study was not pre-registered. We first ran these models, then realized there was a second cohort study, and thought, well, let's just pre-register the modeling strategy as we followed in the 1958 study with the same expectations, namely the expectations that we would expect to find the pattern that Block and Fraley found, namely that adults conservatism correlates positively with traits related to negativity bias in childhood. So being upset, worried, angry in childhood. So what I'm showing you here are unstandardized regression coefficients for the childhood traits that we have in the 2 panels. It's important to say that the childhood traits in the 2 panels are almost exactly similar, both in terms of content and in measurement. There's only one extra item in one of the 2 panels. Conservatism is coded from liberal 0 to most conservative 1. And these are unstandardized coefficients. So you expect to see positive correlations between more negative childhood traits and conservatism if the theory is correct. So what you see here are for a general conservatism measure. So all the conservatism items grouped together into a composite conservatism dimension. That's what Block and Fraley did. And then we have the different childhood traits, and you expect at 2 age points, right? At age point 5 and 10 in the BCS, and at 8.7 and 11 in the 1958 cohort study. You would expect to see a consistent positive association with statistically significant results if the theory is correct. What would be statistically significant? So positive coefficients and then confidence intervals that don't overlap with 0. The independent variables are also correlated to range from 0 to 1. So here actually the range of the axis is really is missing, but the effects are really tiny. And the most important thing to see is that they go in both directions. They're rarely statistically significant and circle really around 0 for conservatism. So we also said, well, maybe it's just social conservatism, right? That's another expectation you could have. That's what you see here. Sometimes you see something that could be in the expected direction. For instance, in the NCDS, we find positive coefficients between childhood tendencies to fight and conservatism, but then in the BCS 70, we don't find statistically significant results. So across panels, and often also across different waves, we don't find any consistent patterns. Also, when you go to economic conservatism, the pattern is basically all over the place. And here you actually see the range of the x-axis. It's really tiny effects also, right? It's really, really tiny. And that's probably, if anything, you would expect tiny effects, but they're also not consistent. So let's talk a little bit more about the evidence. We have 27 statistically significant results. But out of these 27, if we calculate the Q value, which is an indication of a false positivity rate, we get an indication that 15 out of these 27 findings are most likely false positives, because we are repeatedly testing, right? Every time against a p-value of 0.05. So at some point, some things will be statistically significant. The base factors, if we calculate these, we get a better idea of the strength of the evidence for the null hypothesis, because the failure to reject the null hypothesis is obviously not evidence for the null hypothesis. And they give strong to very strong evidence in most cases for the null hypothesis of no association between childhood traits and adult ideology. We also do a whole bunch of robustness checks. We see block and block analyze men and women differently. We controlled for gender, but also if we analyze them separately, nothing shows up. We add some adult control variables, nothing really changes. And some people like Mark Brandt have argued that it's not ideology, but it's extremism that correlates with personality. So if we fold the scale at the middle and create an index of extremism, we also find no evidence for any systematic associations with personality. So what is this evidence? This first piece of evidence shows us that even when people said, well, wait a second, you don't replicate the original Science Oaksley et al. Paper, but we still know that personality correlates with politics. We said, well, childhood personality traits are at least not so consistently associated if we have two very large samples, because there are over 4,000 respondents in each of these two panels. We don't find a systematic pattern that you would expect to find based on the preliminary evidence that we have seen from two other studies. Obviously, you could say, well, it's context. UK is different than the US. That's true, but the theory doesn't really say anything about context, at least not in the Western world. Ariel Malka has said some things about that personality might be differently associated with in Eastern Europe with ideology, but the UK seem to behave generally quite dissimilar to the United States when it comes to the personality politics literature. So I don't think context is a real issue. One explanation you could have is that we have adult ideology in their 40s, so mid-adulthood. And what we know from the work in behavior genetics is that the childhood effects are washing out when people become older. And that might be the thing that we're seeing here compared to the Fraley and Block at the Block papers, which both had adult ideology at age 18 to 26. So it could be indeed that the effects are washing out. The problem is, in this data, we don't have ideology measures around 18, 22, 26. And you cannot go back and ask these people, what did you feel about ideology at age 20, 26? So we cannot really test that, but that could be one possible explanation. But it would still mean that this continuity that has been described in this literature between childhood traits and ideology is also not as consistent as we have been presenting it is. So the title of the talk was Reconsidering this relationship. So we thought, well, okay, so there's maybe also some questions to question the assumed universal causal pathway. And the second part of this talk, the last 10 minutes, I'll talk about some of that work that we have been doing. Because you could still say in adulthood, we have self-reported personality traits that predict or are associated with political preferences. But then the question is, what is going on in adulthood? And in the state of the art in this literature, in adulthood, you see predominantly cross-sectional studies with an implicit causal ordering. they and again, I have also done this, right? This is not me telling, oh, everybody else had done it wrong and I am going to just tell you how it done it correct. You can look at my papers. I also have this implicit or actually also explicit causal ordering in my own writing, where it goes from personality to politics. That is often justified, as I just said, by the fact that people say, well, personality develops in childhood, it's stable, it's heritable, it has neurological correlates, and politics comes later in life. But the design obviously doesn't say anything about this evidence for this idea. But we also indeed know that personality is relatively stable. It has rank order stability, it's heritable. Well, I just told you that. But we also know that personality can change over a person's lifetime. These changes are small, but we also know that's actually the same for politics. And we also know recent evidence that personality can be changed by interventions. So is it true that we can only assume that personality has a causal effect on politics, or could the reverse also be true, that politics has an effect on personality? Well, at least if you say this, well, personality is not entirely stable. And in fact, there might be some reasons to think that politics might influence your personality. So we know that people may come to adopt the behavioral and experiential tendencies of politically like-minded others. We see evidence that people live and interact with people that are similar to them in terms of their political preferences. And are they maybe adopting the personality that comes with that? So that's one argument you could have. And second, you could see that, well, people might have certain stereotypes. They might have, and they might be motivated either to reduce dissonance or to self-present themselves in a way to present themselves as similar to the stereotypical ideological group they belong to. So what does this mean? If you're a left-wing progressive, you might want to say you're very open-minded and tolerant because that is part of the stereotype of being left-wing and progressive. It is something different than to translate that into behavior, right? It's easier to say I'm very open and tolerant towards migrants than to actually open your house for migrants. But there might be certain presentational goals, and maybe even, yeah, you might want to reduce some dissonance and say, well, I am like the stereotypical group. And we know that people have stereotypes in their minds about their particular parties. So we have two sets of ways of testing this. The first is with panel studies, which don't prove causality, but can approximate somewhat causality. So we have done a couple of panel studies, cross-like panel studies, where we have repeated measures of personality and political preferences, and we have done experiments. So first, the panel studies. So here is what the stylized model looks like. We focus on closed personality, so that's the negativity bias, and in particular, we focus here on traits that have been associated with right-wing political preferences, so closed-mindedness, the reverse of openness to experience, conscientiousness, and authoritarianism, but authoritarianism in the dispositional sense of the word, right? So the Feldman and Stanner work, where authoritarianism is a trait measured with child-rearing values, and not right-wing authoritarianism, which is somewhere between a personality trait and an attitude, in my reading of this literature. So we're focusing on the child-rearing component of authoritarianism. What we would expect in the traditional model is that if you become more close, let me say it differently. Lacked close-mindedness has a positive effect on subsequent right-wing policy preferences. That's the traditional model. The hypothesized alternative model that we also bring in here is like, well, maybe also lacked right-wing political preferences have a subsequent effect on more closed personality. So we test the two competing pathways in this paper. I'm going to show you one panel that we did, and you want to read the paper for the other panel studies. So we used the GASES panel, which is a panel in Germany. Here you see the coefficients that belong to the different to the cross-legged panel model. I'll talk you through it. On the left-hand side, you see the traditional hypothesis. So lacked closed personality on subsequent right-wing policy preferences. We have here in the cases, we have opposition to the EU and right-wing policy preferences. And you see in the left-hand panel, there's a positive, small but positive, statistically significant coefficient of more closed personality on subsequent right-wing preferences, as you would expect. The hypothesized alternative pattern is on the right-hand panel, where we see that there is an almost equally sized small but positive coefficients of lagged right-wing policy preferences on subsequent closed personality. And this is in the gases panel measured with 2 items capturing into openness and 2 items capturing conscientiousness, whereby openness is reverse coded, right? So that's an indicator of closed-mindedness. This is a panel that runs for 6 years. So we had 3 measures, 15, 17, and 19. We did similar things with the LIS panel, which is a population-based panel in the Netherlands that runs for, we have data for over 15 years. So we have it at 3 time points. We also did this with the US GSS panel, which is a 4-year panels that run in the US in the period 2008, 2012, and 2010, 2006, 2010, 2008, 2012, and 2010, 2014. So we pull these panels together. Across these 3 panels, we see the similar pattern. So there's evidence for the, if we go back to the stylized figure, we see evidence for the traditional pathway, but we also see evidence for the hypothesis of alternative pathway. So it seems that there's a reciprocal relationship of equal size. But these panels are obviously not perfect for capturing the causal relationship. So we also thought, let's do some survey experiments. And we hypothesized that making political preferences salient would cause people to report levels of personality traits that were more aligned with their previously assessed political preferences. So what we're going to do here is present you evidence from 2 two-way survey experiments, one with the Big Five and one with authoritarianism. We did this on MTurk in the United States. We selected MTurkers with a relatively high approval rating. We did this in March 2020, and with the Big Five with 1,750 respondents, and with authoritarianism with a little over 2,000 respondents. We have 2 wave experiments. So in wave 1, we ask people's political preferences and party identification, liberal conservative self-placement, presidential approval, and policy attitudes. Then a week later, we re-invited people. And at the start of the survey, we introduced people with we manipulated people a little bit. So we have a political prime condition or a placebo control condition. In the political prime condition, we said, well, this survey is about politics. And next, we asked people to report their partisanship, their ideological self-placement, cultural conservatism, economic conservatism, and presidential approval. Both the Big Five experiment and the authoritarianism experiment have the similar setup. In the authoritarianism experiment, we added an additional thing, is that we also said, well, write something that you like about your own party, dislike about the other party. That's from Samara Klaar. In the placebo control condition, we said this survey is about your browsing preferences, and people received a set of questions about their browsing preferences, internet use, social network use, online shopping, online video games. Importantly, the structure of these questions was similar to the structure of the questions in terms of the wording and the response scales to the ones that we use for the political prime condition. And what we expected, and then in the authoritarianism experiment, again, they had to write something what they liked about their favorite piece of equipment. Post-treatment, so after the prime, we asked people to self-report their personality in the Big Five experiment and their authoritarianism in the authoritarianism experiment. And what we expected, remember, this is the goal of the experiment. We hypothesized that making political preferences salient would cause these self-reported personality traits in wave 2 to be closer aligned with their previously in week 1 assessed political preferences. So what I'm going to show you here are estimates from interaction effects. This is from the Big Five experiment with different composites of ideology. And what we see is that every time in the politics prime condition, wave one, right-wing political preferences have a stronger association with closed personality. So that is closed-mindedness and conscientiousness compared to the placebo control condition. These effects are small, but the primes are also quite subtle. The effects for authoritarianism are the same. So it doesn't really seem to matter how we operationalize ideology. That it is always more or less in the same pattern. The p-values hover a little bit around what you would expect, but we can talk about that. But it's all in the same direction, and the effects are modest. But that is, I think, what you would expect with these priming studies. So what does this show? Well, the second part showed that this personality politics relationship in adulthood is also bidirectional. There's an effect from personality on politics, but there's also an effect of politics on personality. This has implications for the methods that we use. Small amounts of endogeneity could bias the estimates of personality on politics. So let's quantify it. In a standard model with the list panel in the Netherlands, the effect of close-minded personality on EU opposition towards the EU as a coefficient of 0.05. In the cross-leg model, that coefficient goes by a factor 2 and becomes smaller. We only 0.02, and it's actually not statistically significant anymore. That is not super important, right? But it has, I think the finding has more important implications for society and the theory, because it suggests that, remember that I started, polarization is often discussed in a bit of an alarming way when we talk about the personality politics relationship, because if it's rooted in personality, it cannot change. But there might actually be a different take on polarization here. Polarization might actually also exacerbate by people on different sides of the political spectrum adopting or perceiving themselves as possessing different personality traits. Obviously, these are self-reports, so whether this translates into behavior, we don't know, but it could have that slightly different interpretation of what polarization could do. And so polarization is not only the consequence of underlying non-political psychological differences. Instead, opposite political loyalties might motivate people to enhance these psychological differences. So to wrap up, I have showed you a little bit where the evidence has led me from being somewhat of a believer of the personalities at the root of politics, starting off with the fact that we couldn't replicate the science paper with physiology and getting the response well, but we know all this about personality in politics. I have provided you some evidence that at least for the link with childhood personality, that doesn't seem immediately replicable in another context with some slightly different measures, but relatively close replication. We don't find these similar results. And then if we zoom in on adulthood, we see that no, the relationship doesn't seem to be one directional from personality to politics. It seems a bidirectional relationship. So this leads to an open question for this literature: if, when, and how is the personality politics link there, and what do we now actually know about this, and how does personality get connected to politics? Under which conditions and in what direction? And that is an open question. Curious what you think about this, but this is where my thought process has ended at this point, and I want to thank you for your time here today.
Thank you, Bert, for the great talk. Really interesting stuff. And yeah, we can open up for questions. Gordon.
Hi. Excuse me. Yeah. Thank you for a really interesting talk. And I should say I'm a great enthusiast for your approach to these questions in general. But this is just a bit of a vague thought. I always find it a little strange to talk of personality as the cause of ideology, or even the reverse, because you know, our personality and ideology, really, that's sort of thing that it's sensible to talk about as causes. So presumably personality and ideology, or particular positions along those continua, serve some sort of adaptive function for the people who hold them, which could either be a response to the local ecological environment, or it could reflect frequency dependent selection of some kind. So in economics, as you know, probably the way they think of personality in terms of one's relative ability to carry out particular kinds of operations. So if you're an extrovert, that's a way of saying that you're relatively efficient at fulfilling certain types of social role. So if the ultimate causal factors are these sort of ecological or adaptive factors, I'm not sure that I find it easy to think about personality as a thing causing ideology as a thing, or vice versa. I mean, would we be better off thinking about what the particular ecological responses or adaptive functions or whatever each of these things are representing, and then seeing what those have or do not have in common?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I tell it like it is from how I became maybe somewhat smarter, but in at least more reflective of this literature. I think you are pointing to a bigger discussion that is sort of underlying this literature now for a period where, say, okay, so we've also, the one thing I've mentioned that the effect sizes are small here, right? One thing that is not always done proper is that especially the coverage in the popular press suggests that these effects are much bigger than that they are in real life. And so the effects I've showed here are all small. You could still say, well, that could be meaningful, but it's not that you knowing your score on openness gives me much chances of predicting your ideology or vice versa, right? And that suggests, if I might say, Gordon, that maybe there are indeed certain shared underlying components that sometimes bring this together. It could be shared from the individual, right? That's what Brad Verhulst and Pete Hatemi have been arguing in sort of the behavior genetics work, but it could also be that sometimes the society or elite communication makes that we sometimes see some of these observational patterns of association, while in fact they are two relatively independent systems. That's one part of the answer. The other part, I do think that's the line from ideological positions to personality. We do see that people, especially in the United States, but in polarized systems, have clear ideas of what it is to be on the one part of the spectrum or the other. And that could mean that people have also in their surveys have tendencies to report who they are more in line with their ideological group. Whether or not that means that it's a real cause that it's changing personality for good, that this study cannot show. Whether this translates into behavior, we don't know. But that there's that in the self-reports we see this occurring. The two experiments we did do seem to suggest that. I think especially the experiments seem to suggest that. That doesn't, I think what you're pointing out does lead to a broader question, right? How does this translate into actual behavior or actual society? And that I think is an open-ended question for us now. So it's I hope this two combinations partly reflect, but I think you are rightly calling out that we need more reflection on, well, are these when and what is actually what we should expect here in terms of the causal relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Bert. Very nice talk, very interesting. And I got a couple of questions. The first one is to reconcile your second set of data with the first one. Presumably, you have to assume that at some point, people's personality has changed because of their politics, so that you no longer have a correlation between the childhood and the adult. Yeah. Right. I mean, that sort of is reconciling the two outcomes. Yeah, I just wanted to see whether you agree with me on that.
Yeah, yes. And, you know, sometimes, especially this replication with when you don't have control of the data of the study design is that you have to do with whatever people with the best intentions at any, well, they didn't design the study with my research design in mind. I would have really liked to have ideology measures a little earlier on, because that would have been a better test of this relationship. Because actually in the NCDS 1958, there is also adult personality, and you do see that these adult personality correlates are consistent with what other UK samples have shown, and this literature in general in the cross section seem to show. But we cannot. I think you are right that this is the interpretation, but I have no knowledge of a data set that would allow me to test it to connect the dots.
Yeah. Okay. Now the second question I have is relating to naturally occurring variation across cultures and space. And just to pick one example, if you go to New York City versus Alabama, you will find a very different profile of political attitudes. Does this mean that New Yorkers' personality is also very different from the personality of people in Alabama? Is there any evidence for that because you have vast differences in political ideology within United States, between countries, shouldn't there also then be a change in personality underlying that? And if not, how would you explain that? Or if not, is it all relative, so that you become a little bit more open in the background? So what's going on there? What's your sense?
No, so, well, I think, first of all, I'm re-echoing, the effects are small and across the board, but small could still be meaningful, right? It could still be, and especially if you really start to perceive yourself as being different, who knows, you might start acting in the long run as being as slightly different. There is some work on geographical variation in personality, and it does seem that there's work by I think it's Sam Gosling has done some of this, where they have these large data sets with people who but let me check that, Stephen, after the talk. Let me follow up on that over email. But there is some work on geographical spread, just like that there is in political attitudes, in terms of the stereotypes that you described. Right, people in New York have on average, a different set of political beliefs than the people on average in Alabama, and that pattern, as I remember, it has in the personality literature also seems to have some of that suggestion. With the data is not perfect, right, because it's all self-selection into these that you want to report your personality. The nice design that I have had in my mind is that if you could follow people when they move around, right? So move through the country. If you could track people over time and see how that, it becomes complicated, because you could both see that both personality and politics are associated with where you select into, and then how you respond to that environment.
There is data on that. I mean, Americans tend to move into zip codes that are close to their own politics. There's the segregation. People choose to live with others who are like them.
Yeah, and that, if you would have their pre-moving preferences and personality, you could get a little closer to that combination. I think that would be a nice follow-up. I'm not sure if we could really disentangle the causal relationship, but at least to see some of the patterns, if they are aligning. I think that would be a fascinating combination of data.
Indeed. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions. First is about the 1958 cohort. That's the British one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I worked with that data set, and if I remember correctly, they have you have measures at ages of 22, 33, 42, and 50, right?
They have asked these people at different. They have surveys at different age periods. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And your results speak to only the difference between when you measure. So childhood would be 7 and 11, right? And then adulthood would be 50, or you have 41. Okay, so
well, so as far like it's been a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago since I looked at the code books, but as far as I remember, it was only ideology at 42. But if that, because that's how
they might have surveyed ideology. I don't know about ideology. I just remember that they have measures, at least for depression and stuff like that. They do have in early adulthood and
no,
so
but we
need
the crucial part is that we need the political preferences, and these have been a little scarcer because obviously the interest in these cohort studies is not per se in politics, but in other aspects of life that are important as well.
Yeah. Okay. So that was just one thing that I wanted to know. The other comment that I have is regarding the motivational presentation, right? How people are motivated to talk about or to present themselves as part of the group. And I have work about something similar, talking about the tensions and the differences between politics and personality and emotion. So in the emotional domain, when people were when we surveyed in the Americans after the 2016 presidential election and anchored the elections, you obviously see a difference in their mood, in their depression. But when you don't anchor the election, you just say, well, 2015, 2016, 2017, you don't see that difference between Democrats and Republicans. So,
that's cool.
And in the same study, we later see, and again, talking about the differences between self-report and objective measures, you see at least in the affective reaction that you don't really get a difference between liberals and Republicans in how they in other measures and in their depression levels. So so I think that there's maybe some intuition about the differences between the self-report, this disconnect between self-report and what you can call the real behavior, at least from the emotional domain. So that would be interesting to see from the political.
Yeah. Could you send me that? Could you send me that paper, because I think that is fascinating, and I hope I made it clear in this talk that everything we do are self-reports, and that it limits to the self-reports. I think we could be defensive and say, well, that's less important, but obviously a lot of this literature has relied on self-reports as considered that important evidence. So in that sense, it is important, but as I said before, whether it translates into real behavior, we don't know. I'm agnostic about it, maybe even a little skeptical, but I do think the self-presentational aspects are important, right? If you think about current things, right, that happen in Europe with a lot of people might want to be tolerant and open, but it's something different than to open your house for Ukrainian family than to tell that you are open. in a survey. And so I think that disconnect makes a lot of sense. Obviously, there are other constraints why you might or might not open your house for Eucharistic space and other very valid reasons. But I think there's something in the self-presentational aspect that we're capturing. But the thing a little bit, Almog, is that our design wasn't particularly suited to capture the exact mechanism. We captured the effects of making it salient, but how is not really what this design can do. But it's an important question. I'd really like to see your work on subjective and more objective measures in the post Trump or the Trump election. That seems super important.
Great, I'll send it around. And I want to apologize. I'll have to drop off. Fabio will replace me as moderating the discussion. So thank you so much for.
Yeah, thank you.
And Angelo.
Yeah, thank you, Bert, for the presentation. Very interesting. I don't have a specific question, but just a general comment about two sources of bias I also observed in these self-reported studies on personality. It's not a source of bias specific of these studies, but probably extends to the whole field of political psychology. I mean, we know a lot of things about the right wing, and we have a lot of psychometric tools to measure ideology in the right wing. We have economic conservatism, social conservatism, SDO, right-wing authoritarianism, a lot of measures about conservative spiritualism, dogmatism, etc. But we know almost nothing about the left wing. We don't even have scales to measure left-wing ideology. That's something very striking. And I don't even understand why we don't have even a theory about the differences between economic and social leftism as we have for the right wing, right? So probably if we observe a difference of 0.2 or even less in a single item Likert scale representing the political spectrum, maybe there are some very interesting differences. I mean, among more specific instances of ideology, right? And we know, for example, that the rise of economic conservatism has changed a lot the landscape in the right wing, even the personality and the values of conservative people. But do you think it's a problem also for these designs?
Well, yeah, I think social scientists in general, we need to pay attention to measurement. I think that is one thing that I think I hear you say, and you know, sometimes we're obviously also not. Not everybody is rich to do their own work, right? Their own data collection. So you're dependent on what other people have decided to include in surveys, and then you quite often run into the fact that people have chosen to measure a lot of different concepts with very brief measures. And if these concepts are pretty complicated and broad, then measurement with single or double item questions, it becomes noisy. That's one thing. I also think I hear you say in attention to effect sizes. I think that is another aspect that we should be doing. I do think that in economic conservatism there is some work. You might have seen the work by Christopher Johnston and Chris Federico and Howard Levine that have done quite good work, in my opinion, on how to connect personality to, for instance, economic conservatism, saying that it's mostly that actually sophistication conditions that relationship. Whether or not it's true, that's a different thing, but it's at least to capture some of the heterogeneity that I think I also heard you say. So say, well, it's actually that once you are highly sophisticated, you pick up the cues in the environment and you connect your personality to your economic preferences. Well, if you're lower on sophisticated, it actually becomes a less consistent association. Well, yeah, I think that is one way to see it. Moving beyond direct effects is, I think, something that is partly in the next step for this agenda. That it's, if anything, if there is a cautioning what Gordon was saying, if anything, if there are direct associations, they should probably be, maybe they're there in specific subgroups or specific instances, and that is, I think, requires careful theorizing and testing with large samples.
Yeah, but even in your design, I mean, you are basically studying the relationship between personality and right-wing constructs, and assuming that the opposite of those right-wing constructs is being liberal. You know, but why not? Yeah, sorry, Steve.
but these scales, I mean, you know, they have two ends. I mean, I'm not sure that it's fair to say people just study right wing, whatever. I mean, you may report it as conservatism, but the scale is a liberal to conservative scale.
Okay, now I understand the question, Stephen. No, yeah, this is I've been talking maybe in a binary and focusing on right wing, but these are all continuous scales that go from left wing progressive to right wing conservatism. Conservative, in most cases, have items that are both where high scores would mean more conservatives, and sometimes actually also reverse worded so that we have to recode it. So there is variation, and that we also have people that score on the high end of the scale, so being right wing conservative, and people on the low end of the scale. So there is variation there.
Yeah, but for example, if you take the measure of, sorry, I'm probably talking too much, but if you take the measure of right-wing authoritarianism and you assume that people that score low in that scale is very left-wing, I mean, that's not a good psychometric approach, I think, because there are a lot of people, very conservative people, that is not high in right-wing authoritarianism.
Yeah, but so that's I'll try to clarify that this is not right-wing authoritarianism. This is authoritarianism in the tradition of Peltman and Stanner, which is more a disposition than an attitude construct, and a active measured with questions about child rearing attitude. So would your child be obedient or more independent? And so we get a continuum from low authoritarianism to high authoritarianism.
Okay.
There's actually some interesting work by Tom Costello coming out on left-wing authoritarianism. I think it's forthcoming in JPSB. But this is not right-wing authoritarianism, because my problem with right-wing authoritarianism is that that item wording partly consists ideological constructs, and then we are correlating ideology with ideology, or at least there's more conceptual overlap. So that's why we don't do work with that construct.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bert. I think we have a couple of minutes left for a quick question, if there is one. Oh, Gordon.
Yeah, just one quick one, not to use up too much time. Yeah, as you know, some people, I mean, people express different personalities across different situations, right? And some people are much more consistent than other people. I mean, they're consistently consistent, as it were, in terms of how they express the same personality characteristics across lots of different situations. And it seems for those people, it's more like a central part of their identity.
Yeah.
So there probably aren't any sets of data one could use to look at this at the moment, but I wonder if you could just look at the personalities of people who are consistent in the personalities they express across situations, and whether you could get stronger correlations with ideology in that sort of case.
That's an interesting idea. I haven't thought about that, but I think that's an interesting opportunity. And you could vice versa do this for ideology, right? People with a more consistent belief system.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a nice idea. Thanks.
Okay, so we are right on time. It's 2 o'clock. I think we can wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bert, for your talk. And thank you everyone else for participation. And see you next Friday.
Okay, take care. Thanks for coming. Bye.